Hi everyone and welcome to our seventh session of our professional development course. In today's session we are going to work with testing, and this is a very hot issue because testing is a big part of education and is one of the most controversial topics. Some people rely a lot on testing, some people don't, and to be very honest, this has been one of the most difficult parts for me as a teacher, as an instructor, because I usually see test as a moment of a lot of stress, not only for the students but also for me, because sometimes you are in the class administering a test and then the students are asking those questions that you say, but this student hasn't been here in class with me, because you hear those questions that are not the type of questions that you expect in a test, like ¿cuál es el pasado del verbo to be? Questions that are really, um, I would say, heartbreaking. So, if we go to slide number 2, what it says there is what is a test? And I brought a very famous and a very popular definition that says that test is a measure or a method of measuring a person's ability or knowledge in a given domain. And I'm going to break down a little bit this idea. First of all, one thing that we have to bear in mind is that what we are doing here, we are evaluating something that is happening in the person's brain. So it's not easy to test something that you cannot actually see. So one of the things about testing is that sometimes tests cannot tell us the amount of knowledge the students have. That's why, and this has been something very important in my career, I don't rely only on tests. Even though I said test, and I think they are a very important instance to a very important educational moment, but at the same time, I have portfolios, I have homework, I have other issues or other activities, other tasks that inform me about the knowledge that the student has. So this is something that we need to take into account. There is one form, one measure of knowledge, but it's not the only one, and it's not the one that is going to tell us exactly what's going on. So if in your class, for example, and this usually happens, let's imagine your register book, your libreta, okay? You have nothing, and then you have a test, 7. So that student is a 7, cannot be a 4, because you are relying on the test as the most important thing. Then it says knowledge. So it is important, this part there, because you are evaluating their knowledge, not your knowledge. Sometimes it happens that the students tell you, teacher, qué fácil que está el escrito. That is a good indicator. Why is a good indicator? Because it means that you are checking what they know. When they say, I know nothing about what you are doing, or I know nothing about this test, is because you are not checking what you need to check. And that is very important. And then in a given domain, that in our case is EFL. Okay, if we go to the next slide, I'm sorry, there's a little sticky. I have some questions that we have to reflect. So the first question says, should the test be the only way of measuring ability and knowledge? Well, I anticipated some of my perspective. I don't think that the test can be the only way of measuring ability and knowledge. Why? Because as I said, knowledge is something that is a process that is going on in the brain of the person. So if it is something that is internal, if it is something that is going on in the brain, there are other factors that also affect that knowledge. For example, the environment. Do you think that an environment, when you are testing someone, is an environment that is friendly? Absolutely not. And if we consider one of the theories from Stephen Krashen. Stephen Krashen, one of the theories of Stephen Krashen was the affective filter theory. And if you remember, he said that whenever we are stressed, whenever we are under pressure, whenever we are under this difficulty, we usually have something that is called the emotional barrier. So the emotional barrier heightens. Let's imagine that here is the emotional barrier. So the emotional barrier heightens, so I cannot learn. But if you are comfortable, if you are in a friendly atmosphere, if you don't feel threatened, if you are okay, so then the emotional barrier goes down. This is the reason why we have an icebreaker in our plan. Why the icebreaker? Because after you do something that is kind of nice, a game or something like this, then you feel at ease and then you start to learn. Okay? So, as I said before, in my opinion, the test cannot be the only source of information for you. You need to inform yourself by observing your students. You need to look at their homework, look at their notebooks, the interaction. You have to pay attention to how they work in groups. You have to pay attention to so many different things. You have to see their portfolios in order to see the process they are doing. So there are several things that you need to consider whenever you are going to evaluate your students. So for that reason is that I'm telling you that you need to pay a lot of attention and don't use the test as the only source of information. The second question says, is a test always reliable? I don't know what you think, but I have seen many tests in my life because I work with colleagues a lot. I have done my own tests as well, but at the same time, I have been a mentor teacher, so I have seen tests from different people. And sometimes we believe that our test is really reliable. And when I say reliable, what I mean is that it really represents what the students know. And sometimes it's not. I mean, sometimes we have tests that are so obvious, or sometimes tests that are so difficult that we want to put another barrier to the learning process instead of making it easier and instead of making it comfortable and instead of making it meaningful. So this is something that sometimes happens, that we are in front of tests that do not prove that I know about the subject. And probably this is one of the most difficult parts because whenever we are thinking of a test, sometimes we don't think of several aspects that are really important. And then when we are grading the test, we say, but this person cannot have such a low mark having done almost the whole test. Or the other way around. This person cannot have such a high grade without having done, for example, the writing part. So this is something that we need to consider. And obviously, in our case, we have our supervisors that have thought about this. And this is why we have certain rules and we have certain rubrics that we need to consider and we need to follow in order to grade students. The third question we have is, which knowledge am I testing? The one I think they have or other? And when I said other, I didn't want to be picky at that moment. But sometimes what happens is that it's like a race. Who knows more in the class, the students or the teacher? So this is not a race. I remember when I was a student, some of my teachers were trying to making it really, really, really hard. So we had very low marks. So that proved that they were excellent teachers. That proved that they were, amazing instructors. Not at all. I mean, what you want to what you want to achieve is that people are really uh, tested in what they have learned. So if I learned how to work with the thematic unit sports, I will not test my students on entertainment or I would say health. I mean, because what I'm going to do is I need to be coherent in what I'm going to do with them. The next question is which given domain, and it's English. But not only English, it's the content. I mean, when I say English, it's not grammar. So I don't need to test only grammar. Grammar is part of the test, but also the content I have been teaching in my class. So whenever you are testing, it's obvious that you need to pay attention to grammar, you need to pay attention to language awareness, you need to pay attention to all the details that you need to do. But at the same time, another thing you have to do, you have to be really careful that you are also working with the thematic units and with the topics that you have been working with in class. So having these first initial ideas, one thing that is important to know is what makes a good test. Because there are several tests, and sometimes, and it has happened to me so many times that I can tell you, sometimes we create a test and we are not very happy with the test we have created. And then there are other times that we create tests that we say, wow, this is a test. And then when we administer the test, it's not very effective with the students because maybe it's not very reliable or because it lacks face validity. And I'm going to tell you about this concept later on. But it's very important that whenever you set a test and whenever you plan a test, your test is coherent with what you did in class. And these concepts are in the next slide. So if you move to slide number 4, it says what makes a good test. And the first one is good timing. Sometimes we create wonderful tests, but the time is not enough for the students. And when I say it's not enough for the students, it's because sometimes we plan, even though we know that we have to plan a certain amount of activities, some people plan longer activities, or they have longer text, or they have writing activities that are too hard and confusing for the students. So what I wrote there is that you have to plan your test according to the time your students will have allotted. For example, I used to teach at nocturnos, and at nocturnos we had 30 minutes. The hour was 30 minutes. So it would be fair for them if instead of 2 hours they would have 3 hours. Because if I give 2 hours of 45 minutes to my other students, it's fair for them to have 3. Then it says, remember that writing takes a minimum of 25 minutes. In my own experience, what I used to do is I used to devote 45 minutes to the first part and 45 minutes for the writing activity, because in the writing activity, they have the pre-writing and they have to think and they have to do a lot of stuff, so they need time in order to do a good job. The second characteristic of a good test is coherence. And when I say coherence, this word can be applied to anything, and can be applied to planning, can be applied to class delivery, and in this case it's applied to testing. And why I'm saying so? Because coherence has to do with this, with doing exactly the same you were doing in class. For example, if you are working with, as I said before, if you are working with entertainment or if you're working with sport, you're not going to check health. You have to be coherent. And then if you are teaching grammar in class, then, or if you are not teaching grammar in class and then you ask grammar in your test, that is not fair. If the only activity you do to check reading comprehension in class is answer the questions, it's not fair that you include another activity that is more complicated or that is maybe more original than asking questions, but they haven't tried yet. So whatever you do in the test had to be done before in class. So nothing new in the test in terms of the type of exercises you are asking. They need to know the mechanics of how to do the test. So what I wrote there is that your test needs to be coherent with what you teach. You cannot test what you don't teach not only in terms of content, but also in terms of exercise layout. And this is what I told you. If you never taught how to do a true or false, don't ask a true or false, because the students don't know the mechanics in this type of exercise. Authenticity. Authenticity. That is very important as well. I mean, the test needs to have some authentic or pseudo authentic activities. And why I'm saying this? Because sometimes we ask things in the test that have nothing to do with real life. So think, this exercise or this activity, when or where in real life I would do it, and try to contextualize it in a good way. For example, when we ask students, write a letter to a friend about what you did last night. How often do we write letters? How often do we write letters to friends? How often do we have letters to friends when we talk about what we did last night? Very rarely. I mean, what do we usually do is write an email, write a text. So you have to find other ways to contextualize and to do what you want to do. Then it says, this characteristic goes hand in hand with coherence. Since you should plan authentic activities, the activities in the test should be authentic or pseudo-authentic. That is absolutely essential. Absolutely essential. When you plan an activity, think why the students would do this? Because I just say it, or because it's something that is meaningful for them? Validity. And validity is a broad term, and it includes several things. But in this case, I want to talk just about face validity. And do you know what face validity is? Face validity is when the student has the test and the student says, "¿Qué papa, teacher? Esto es una pavada." Why saying so? Because the person, when he sees or when she sees the test, believes that he or she can do it, believes that this is appropriate for the level. So this is face validity. When you see it, you see, this is a good test because it's testing what I learned and not something new. So that's why I said of face validity, the student should see the test and say, I can do it. And this is absolutely important. If your students don't know how to do the test, that is because there is something that is wrong there. And probably what's wrong, I'm not saying that is wrong, but probably what's wrong is the way you planned and the way you designed the test. And talking about this, something that is really important, as English teachers and as PhDs, we have always asked you to work in groups and to work in pairs, sorry, and to be all the time sharing stuff. One thing that usually happens is that, for example, one friend of mine and I plan tests together. And that's absolutely fine because it's very important that you interact and you can have other ideas from colleagues, and that is perfect, and I really embrace that idea. But at the same time, my students are not the same students that he or she has. So I have to be very careful about the type of exercises and the type of activities I include in the test. Because sometimes the students I have are not the same students other people have. Okay, let's go to reliability. I will not say much about reliability because I already said a lot about reliability, but the test should be consistent and should be able to tell you if the person knows what you want to measure. So if you want to measure reading comprehension, it should tell you that the person is comprehending. And remember that comprehension has different levels. And we talked in our previous session about bottom-up and top-down strategies. Well, remember that we need to strike a balance between the two of them, and not only bottom up, which are the most common questions, but also top down. So, and the last one is good feedback. And when I say good feedback, it's not just a number, because what we usually do is just give them a number. And in English, we have always said that we need to give like a written feedback about this. But also, whenever we are in that day after in that day after the test that we have test correction, well, in that day, my piece of advice is don't give them the test at the beginning of the class. Correct what you want to correct, and maybe not the whole test. Maybe they have problems only with writing. Okay, focus on what you want to correct about writing. And what you are going to do is to devote the 45 minutes to correct and to do something related to this. And then at the end of the class, you would give them the test and they will know the mark. But you are giving them a lot of feedback before that. And the other thing is that feedback needs to be timely. When I say timely, I mean that if they have the test today, I will not give them feedback about this test in 2 months. I will give them feedback about this test the following class. This is absolutely important. Then it has to be comprehensible. So if you have to write, don't show off and write in English concepts that they don't know or something like this. Try to use simple language and try to help them improve what they have done. And remember that the role of feedback is always to improve. So when you provide students with feedback is in order for them to improve their performance and also to improve in their mastery objectives. I mean, in how they want to learn more about the skill. So in the next slide, which is number 6, it says what to test. What to test. And I included 5 different categories there. So the first one is listening. And I have some questions for you so you can ask yourself those questions and you can think what you are going to test. The first says, what type of listening do I use in class? Do I use listening in class? Is it checked in a bottom-up or top-down way? In class. Because remember, I have to be coherent. So if I use only bottom-up questions in class, then I cannot use top-down. Do I use my voice or a recording? Because some of us, what we usually do is to read the listening, but then in the test we put a tape recorder. So that is totally different. It's totally different for the students. You are students, you are not used to that. So you have to be very careful about this. How many times do I allow students to listen to the recording? And you have to say that in the instructions. If you ask them to listen like 3 times in class, 3 times in the test. You cannot do it differently. You have to allow them to work in the way that they work in class. Then, what strategies have I taught them? For example, do you usually teach them that they don't have to listen to every word? Do you help them or do you help them develop some strategies? Well, that is up to you. And you are the only one who knows that. So you have to really pay attention to that. Let's move to reading. Have I used the exercises I planned for the test in class previously? Do my students know more than 80% of the vocabulary in the test? Remember what I said about reading last time. Do I use bottom up or top down questions? Why? What's the aim of assessing reading in this case? Because why the students need to answer those questions? Is there any purpose? You have to ask yourself so you do the activity in a very meaningful way. Vocabulary and language. Are you checking the vocabulary and language you taught in class? Are you checking how to use the vocabulary or the vocabulary itself? You have to use, in a communicative approach, you have to use how to use the vocabulary. And you don't have to check the vocabulary itself. For example, you say, the past tense of go. No, the students, I mean, obviously you are going to teach that in class, but they don't need to know that in the test. What they need to know is how to use went. So maybe in a text, you have some spaces and you have to put the word went in a certain place. Writing. Is a writing piece authentic, meaningful, and adequate? Remember the example I gave you about writing a letter to a friend talking about what you did last night. Do you usually do that? How often do you do it? How often do you write letters? How often do you write letters to your friend? And how often do you write letters to your friend telling about what you did last night? Isn't it too awkward? Okay. And adequate for the level of my students. For example, everybody who knows me knows that I hate to ask students to write biographies. I hate it. I mean, I don't like it at all. And some people like it, and it's fine. But I think that writing biographies is one of the most difficult activities ever, and you need to know a lot of things. You need to know in terms of language, you need to know in terms of layout, you need to know in terms of content. So it's so difficult for sometimes for the students to do this type of activity. Then it says, have I planned pre-writing activities that lead my students to the writing activity? Because some people believe that we need to plan the pre-writing activities and then go to the writing part. And it's not true. First of all, you have to think of the pre-writing activity and then think, what do my students need to know in order to get here? And then plan one or two pre-writing activities according to what you think that your students need. So this is a fair way of planning something in order to get to the writing part. And remember that the pre-writing activities need to move the student from the word level into the discourse level. So they are sometimes the activities we plan are only at the word level and you miss the sentence level. And then you ask them to write a paragraph or you ask them to write a text, and this is at the discourse level. So you have to be very careful about this. Then, are the instructions clear? Because sometimes I write an email to a friend. Okay, but you can give them prompts. You can tell them, okay, include this and this and this and this and this. This is one part. The other part is, do they have pictures? Sometimes when they have pictures, they know or they take ideas from the pictures in order to write better. Do they have rubrics to self-analyze their work? That is essential. I mean, if they have rubrics, then what they are going to do, they are going to say, okay, is it organized? Yes. Is it this? And they are going to be checking each time they do something. Obviously, you need to work with rubrics in class before, and you need to work in a way that all the students know how to work with rubrics. Then, about the test in general, the overall impression, do you think the test is coherent with what you teach? Do you think your students are able to do it? Those are questions that you are the only person that can answer this, okay? So, if we continue with this line of thought, we can say, so how can we create motivating tests? And I have some examples in slide number 7. It says, use topics that are appealing to your classmates. Please, Titanic is a beautiful movie, but it was like 11 years ago or 15 years ago. Sometimes we want to include a movie. That's fine, but include something that is more recent. I mean, and not something that is something we liked. That sometimes our students like, but try to be like more, I would say, less old-fashioned in this. Then check that what you test is what you taught, and that is what I told you. You have to be coherent that what you are testing is what you taught. Use images. Use prompts. Use 12 font. Sometimes we want to make the whole test in one page and it's impossible. So we make it with font number 8. That is not fair. I mean, and it's not attractive. If I see those small little letters, I would not be motivated to read. Then check that the quality of your test is good. And then create a friendly atmosphere for the test and not a threatening one. I know some of my colleagues that say, tomorrow we have a test. Remember, we have a test. Study for the test. Don't do, don't do this. Don't do that. So this is like a soldier field, and students don't feel comfortable when they are like this. So try to be friendly. Try to be nice. Try to be try to lower their affective filter so they can do and they can enjoy actually working with your test. Some people have asked me what they can do when they have very different levels in the classroom. And I had a lot of experience in this because I taught at Nocturnos. And when you teach at Nocturnos, you are going to see that there are people that are very high in the level of proficiency, but then there are others that are struggling. So there are several suggestions I have in the following slide that is called differentiated instruction. And differentiated instruction really means that you have to teach according to the level of your students. So that's why knowing where your students are in terms of your diagnostic test and following observations you are doing is so important. So the first possibility you have is to work at different levels or to test at different levels. So that means that you may have like 1, 2, or 3 different tests in class. And some people may say, yes, but this is not fair because they may say that there are easier tests than others. Not really, because you can have other arguments. You can say that you just prepare 3 tests and you are going to give tests to different people, or you can just say that this is in order for them not to copy. You have different arguments that you can use, and you can actually mask a little bit the original purpose. You can also have the same test with different level. Like for example, the first one is questions for the reading comprehension. You have questions in the first exercise, and you believe that questions are very difficult for some of the students. You can ask other questions, or you can use a true or false if you think that the true or false is easier for those students. I mean, it really depends. I had in the past like people with dyslexia, and those people with dyslexia, what usually happened was that I had a test where they didn't have to write. I just read the sentence and they could answer yes or no, or true or false, or something like this. Different techniques, as I was telling you, you can use different ways of testing in each one, or different ways of administering tests. And I said they're pairs. One of the things I used to do when I was teaching secondary school was to have different types of tests. In some cases, the test was a traditional test, a one-person test with a sheet of paper there. Then some other times it was in pairs because there were some activities that were planned to do in pairs. Sometimes I even did it in groups of 3. So you have to think of different ways of working with tests, and you have to think of different ways of working with assessment. And one important aspect of testing is what comes in the following slide, which is slide number 9, and it's called the washback effect. The one who talks about the washback effect is Douglas Brown in his 2 books. He has many books, but in Teaching by Principles and then in Language Assessment. In Language Assessment in particular, he talks a lot about the washback effect. And what is the washback effect? It's like you wash what it was there and you put something new. And that is represented in the bubbles I have there. So let's start with the brown one that says teaching and learning. So what usually happens is that when we are teaching, the students is learning, okay? And then all of a sudden it comes the time of testing, which is in the green bubble. And what happens in the test? You see or you check how much they learned and how much they didn't learn. So you provide them with feedback. And what happens with feedback? For example, let's imagine that one of my students believes that the past tense of be is bell, which actually happened to me. So be, the past tense is bell. Obviously, that's wrong. So what I do, I correct that and I said, okay, Maria, the past tense of be was where. Okay? And then when I give her the test, I have this 1 minute when I tell her, okay, Maria, pay attention to this. Do you remember that we were working with I was, you were? Well, that is the past tense of the verb to be. And you put bed, which is something totally different, and I can tell her that is comma. In that case, the student is realizing that there is something wrong. That is the washback effect. So the student makes a change in his or her head, and then there is another instance of learning. So one important aspect of this is that sometimes we teach, and then we test, and we only give them a number, and that's it. And that is what I was telling you about feedback, and that was what I was telling you about providing with appropriate and useful and meaningful feedback. Because from that feedback you provide, they are going to relearn, and that is the washback effect. I think it's a fascinating effect, and I think we don't exploit it as it should be, because sometimes we make the test, we give them the number, and that's it. But what happens, I said before that sometimes I had alternative ways of using tests, because I have the feeling that whenever we set a test, it's not the best way to approach testing. I mean, it's one of them, but as I told you before, it's not the only one. So once in a while, and especially now with adults, what I'm doing is project-based evaluation. And for those of you who are working with Ciclo Básico, Uruguay in Focus 1, 2, and 3, they have projects like my favorite restaurant, my city. They have different projects that they can work with along the year. So this project-based learning is an alternative to testing, because sometimes they can do something that is more meaningful. For example, they can work with their neighborhood. So they can go outside, they can see what they can do in the spaces, in the fields that are there with no houses and nothing, what they can create. More self-regulated and individually driven, because in the test it's me the one who is thinking all the time. And in the case of a project-based test, in this case they are the ones who propose the topic, they are the ones who are taking pictures, that are finding or seeking for information, etc. They have more time and they have less stress. Why they have more time? Because you assign like 2 weeks in advance, so they are doing the project, and they have less stress because they can do it at their own pace. And sometimes when you have a test, you say, okay, well, I have only 45 minutes to do this activity, and then you cannot do it, and then you feel really bad about this. It's good for adolescents, but also for adults. I mean, for adults, what I'm saying is that is the way I'm proposing to evaluate adults, by doing projects. And I said, Uruguay in Focus 1, 2, and 3 have project work, so I assume that if teachers use those projects in class, students in 4th, 5th, and 6th should be aware and should be trained in order to work in projects. That's why it says there that is some help in the books. Is a different way of assessment, because you are helping the students when they know the topic. You are helping them find new strategies, find new sources of information. Then when they write, you are helping them to write the activity, and then you are helping them to do this. And then when they get to the end of the project, you have helped them and you have provided them with feedback several times. That's why I am a great believer in project-based evaluation, because process is emphasized, as it says here. Why? Because you are giving and providing feedback all the time since the very beginning, so the process is the most important part. And the outcome is like natural. I mean, after you have been discussing with them and after you have been doing with them so many things, it's obvious that in the end they are going to be absolutely clear about their project. And the last topic I'm going to talk about is grading. And I'm not going to talk much about grading for two reasons. One, because Alice is going to talk about the different grading systems and the way you need to grade in secundaria. The second one is that March 14th, we are planning to have the supervisor in when we give you the degrees. So they are, I mean, the PADs and everyone is telling you how to grade. So I'm not going to go into that. But what I'm going to say is that when you are grading, sometimes you don't need to assign a grade as something that has no support. Like, for example, for me this is a 5, for me this is a 6, for me this is a 7. Since you are working with rubrics in class, or you should be working with rubrics in class, I think rubrics is a good way of assessment and grading too. So you can assign grades, and in this way, it's going to be much easier for you. So the other aspects are how to grade listening. For example, if the word the students need to put in a blank, let's imagine that it's a fill in the blanks. The word that the students have to write in the blank is teacher, and they write T-I-C-H-E-R, teacher, as it sounds. What would you do? Would you mark it as wrong? Well, the answer is no. No, because what you have to pay attention is the way it sounds. If the word teacher sounds as teacher, then in that case it's correct. Because what you are assessing is listening. So what the student listens, the student has to know how to. I mean, the part of the sounds are the ones that you are checking, not spelling at this time. In terms of reading, I remember that when I started working, the questions had 2 points each, and 1 point was for content and 1 point was for grammar. This doesn't happen anymore, because now in the communicative approach, if what they write is correct in terms of content, that is full mark. You cannot penalize grammar in the part of the reading activity. And then in writing, how to grade writing? Okay, I learned something that I think is very important. When the student transmits the message, I mean, when the student knows what he or she is saying, that is half of the points. So if it is out of 30, that is 15. And then you can start counting grammar, you can start counting whatever, but then half of the mark should be in this way. Obviously, if you use rubrics, this is much, much easier, because then your students are going to be used to working with a certain parameter that is going to tell them when something is correct and when something is not correct. Okay? So the task for you for this week is going to be to choose one of your tests and analyze what you are checking, why you are checking that, what you did in class to prepare, between inverted commas, the students for the test, and what kind of environment have you created. Okay? So if you have questions, just let me know. Thank you. Bye.